you recall, we ended up last time looking at the fact that Joseph's brothers had sold him to some Ishmaelites or Midianites, and then he was sold into slavery in Egypt. And that's where that ended. That's the end of chapter 37. Chapter 38, we're not going to cover it this time. It's all about Judah, and we'll talk about that another time when it's more pertinent. And go right over to chapter 39, which tells about Joseph's experience working in Potiphar's home. Interestingly enough, it is a story that stands all by itself, because we're going to end up with finding out this is where Joseph was placed when he was first hired by Potiphar, and he's going to end up in jail. When he ends up in jail, we get to chapter 40, and there 40 on all the way through the book of Genesis, one chapter pretty much follows the other. So we're going to stop at that point and come to that sometime later. But I want to go over chapter 39 because it is a great story in many ways. And what I'm going to do is simply go through that chapter with you as we find it, and then have some comments about it. It's entitled Potiphar's Wife. Let's read this. Now Joseph was taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And the master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hands. Now keep in mind, if we follow the book of Genesis carefully, Joseph was probably only about 17 or 18 years old at the time that he went to work for Potiphar. That was right after he was kidnapped by his brothers. So Joseph found favor in the sight and attended him, in his sight and attended him. And he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. And from the time that he made him overseer of his house and over all that the Lord blessed the Egyptians, the Lord blessed the Egyptians' house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had. And so he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, he had no concern for anything but the food which he ate. Now Joseph was handsome and good looking. We don't know how much time passed, but he goes from a boy from 17 or 18 until he's a little bit older, maybe 25, I would say as much as 25 years old. And here we find him in charge of Potiphar's house, taking care of everything in Potiphar's care. At this time, his master's wife had cast her eyes upon Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused, and he said to his master's wife, "Lo, having me, my master, no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my hand. He is not greater than his house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except yourself, because you are his wife. And how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against the Lord?" Potiphar's wife notices Joseph, and although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie with her, or to be with her. But one day he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was there in the house. And she called him by his garment, saying, "Come, lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. There is a picture of Potiphar's wife and Joseph. Here's another picture. Here's another picture. Here's another picture. You can get any number of pictures. This Sunday, one of the most popular things for artists to do is to draw a picture or to paint a picture involving Joseph and Potiphar's wife. This is only one page out of, I think, about 50 or 60 different pictures that I could have chosen involving Joseph trying to get away from Potiphar's wife. She is doing nothing much more than grabbing onto his garment. And it says that she got a hold of the garment and held onto that. And when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and he had fled out of the house, She called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to insult us. He came in to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment with me and fled and got out of the house." What do you call that? A barefaced lie. No truth to that whatsoever. Then he laid up his garment by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant that you have brought among us came to me to insult me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment with me and fled out of the house." I have a couple of pictures of Joseph being accused. I like that one especially. When his master heard these words which his wife spoke to him, "This is the way your servant treated me," his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. When the man, that's a duplicate side. There we find Joseph in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph care of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the doer of it. And the keeper of the prison paid no heed to anything that was in Joseph's care, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made him prosper. And that is the picture that we have of Joseph as the overseer in the prison. That's the end of the chapter. It's a very short chapter. I want to just say one thing about that chapter. Most of the commentaries that I looked at concerning that chapter indicated that this was a very popular story at that time, not necessarily involving Joseph, but it was an Egyptian story about a man and his wife that took the man's younger brother into his home. And when the man was at work, the wife started to make eyes toward the younger brother. Same sort of scenario. How it all came out, I don't really know. But I thought there ought to be an addendum to this to say a little bit about that. One of the things that I thought about concerned the fact of all those pictures. One of the books that I have is a book by Doré. Does anybody know who Doré was? A French illustrator. And he was a French illustrator, made woodcuts of a lot of things that are in the Old Testament. And I always enjoyed going through that, and every once in a while I would use one of those pictures in one of our lessons. Well, I wanted to see what Doré had to say about Potiphar's wife. And sure enough, I did find a picture of Potiphar's wife in Doré, but not chasing Moses. Not chasing Joseph. Here's Potiphar's wife. Now here are two individuals, I'll mention those in a moment here. This is Potiphar's wife, not chasing Joseph, but where? In hell. In hell. Another thing that Doré liked to make pictures of were things that came from Dante's Inferno. Allegrico, Dante's Inferno. Let's take a look at that a minute here. Dante was, I got a picture of him here. He was an Italian poet, lived around 1300. One of the things that he wrote that was very significant, was written around that time, was called the Divine Comedy. Now the Divine Comedy, as it said, a long narrative poem, and divided into three major sections: Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradise. I can't say it. Hell, Purgatory, and Paradise. And what the Divine Comedy does, it traces the journey of Dante from darkness and error into the revelation of the divine light, culminating in the beatific vision of God. What Dante did with that Inferno said, let's go and take a journey through Inferno, through hell, through Purgatory, and through Paradise, and see what's there. Now, I can remember reading way back when I was in college, reading Hamlet. a very interesting story in Hamlet is in the soliloquy in Shakespeare's Hamlet. He talks about that to die, to dream, or to die perchance to dream. And what does he say about that? A dream for which no one has come back to tell us about. We don't know what was there. But Dante takes it upon himself to say what you're going to run into when you die. It involves infernal, purgatory, and paradise. Now I want to keep in mind this is around 1300 that Dante wrote this. Dante at that time was a member of a part of the Roman Catholic Church. He wasn't in the clergy, but he was a very devout Catholic. And much of what we find both in all three of these things shows very much the tendency of the church to influence what Dante had to say. Right at the outset, I think any of us can pick out one thing right away, and that's purgatory. We don't have purgatory in our religion. But back in Dante's time, purgatory was a rather significant thing. I'll say a little bit more about it a little bit later on. The plot was simple. The man generally is miraculously unable to visit these places. Purgatory, that's the condition or process, this is a quote, condition, process, or place of purification or temporary punishment in which, according to medieval Christian and Roman Catholic belief, the souls of those who die in a state of grace made ready for heaven. Now, let's talk about that. If you die and have committed a mortal sin, you don't have to worry about purgatory. Why not? You'll go directly to hell. No problem about it. But if you haven't committed a mortal sin, you will go to purgatory. Why will you go to purgatory? Well, to get you ready for heaven. Because in the meantime, guess what? You may have committed sins, but they are not mortal sins. They are venial sins. And purgatory is nothing more than expiation of venial sins. I had to look up both of these words to make sure I knew what they meant. Expiation means to get atonement, to get forgiveness for these venial sins. I had a hard time finding out what these venial sins might be. I have a list of some of them, and it doesn't read too well because I had to do a print screen from a big chart that had these venial sins. But these are the things that they're talking about in these venial sins. In this side, it deals with family situations where we can be committing venial sins because of a lack of parental respect, trying to cultivate a place here, failing to be a good example to your family, spoiled or pampered children. Those are venial sins. Here are things that are more for wishing evil about another. Look at prejudice, harboring and grudge, using obscene language. Dumb, have you ever done that? Any one of these are anger. Anyway, these are not things that will condemn you to hell, but you will have to spend time in purgatory to get purged of these things before you are going to be able to go into paradise and to go into heaven. Dante is not going to go alone. He has guides. He has two guides. One of these guides is Virgil. Virgil is, again, a real person. Virgil was a Roman poet. He was a poet that lived about the time of Christ. Very famous as far as the Roman literature is concerned. He's the one that wrote the Aeneid that tells the story about one of the princes of Troy was transported or escaped and came to Rome, and that was the beginning of the city of Rome. Very significant person. Everybody would have known who Virgil was. But you can see he lived in the era of Christ. The other is Beatrice. Beatrice was, well, what I read is that he was the great love of Dante. Dante fell in love with Beatrice when he was 9 years old. He and his family were at the home where Beatrice was living, and he fell in love with that girl. And he loved that girl the rest of his life. He did not marry her. As a matter of fact, Beatrice has a last name, and I think that is her married name. But it was always in his mind that this Beatrice was the epitome of all people. The two people that he has that are going to act as his leaders in this Divine Comedy are then Virgil, who was a Roman poet, and Beatrice. I think I have a picture of Dante standing with Virgil and Beatrice. What we're going to find is that we're going to look rather carefully at what Dante does in Inferno. I'm not going to be saying anything at all about purgatory or about paradise because I haven't done any reading in that at all, and I haven't found too much to read. But I did find a lot about Dante in hell. And what he finds in hell is that there are 9 circles of hell, 9 different divisions of hell. And I'll show you a picture of that. Whoops. No, I've got it. The way Dante pictures it, he says the 9 circles are shown here. They're concentric circles. They go around and around. They go in descending order. The further on, we go all 9 of these circles until we get to the 10th circle. And in the 10th circle is Satan himself. Satan himself encased in ice. But we have all these 9 different circles that are part of Dante's Inferno. And what's significant about these circles? They all designate a certain type of mortal sin that people may have found themselves involved with. Here are the 9 circles. I'm showing them 2 slides here. Very quickly, the first circle deals with limbo. Talk a little bit more about that. The second circle is lust, carnal knowledge, gluttony, avarice or greed, wrath, and the last 3 are heresy, violence, fraud, and treachery. What we're going to do now is to take a look at what Dante has to say about those circles and about the folks that have been doomed to eternal damnation in those circles. Well, to get there, it's going to be necessary for Dante to leave the living world, and he's going to have to cross a river called the River Styx. The River Styx is the river that separates the living world from the rest of the world. The River Styx here is ferried by this man Charon. He has the only boat, and Charon is, well, he has the opportunity of ferrying people over to hell. Only you got to have a ticket. The only ticket apparently I could find is that you had to have the proper amount of money in your mouth. If you didn't have it, you couldn't get on the boat. And when we find out, there were a lot of people that never got on the boat, and they just had to make their way across the River Styx in any way they possibly could. But this is the way this Charon made his living as a boatman. Here is a picture of Charon taking Virgil and Dante across the River Styx. And you notice there are a lot of people that are in the river, still trying to make their way over to hell. Here's another picture, and here we can see also all the folks that are swimming around here with Dante and Virgil here. Here's Charon, the riverman, and they get to hell, and the first thing they do is to go to the first circle in hell. Dante's first circle is resided by virtuous non-Christians and unbaptized pagans who are punished with eternity in an infernal form of heaven. What is that? Well, we have another name for it. It's called limbo. And they are in a limbo. Let's take a look at limbo. Limbo is where the unbaptized and virtuous pagans, like Virgil himself, dwell. Virgil explains that these souls did not sin while they were alive, but because they were not baptized or lived before Christianity took hold, they were unable to go to heaven. Now that includes a lot of people, to say the least. One of the things you'll find very true with any Catholic that you know, that one of the first things they do when a baby is born is to do what? Get him baptized as soon as possible. Get him to be a part of the Roman Catholic Church as soon as possible, so that unbaptized baby would not have to spend eternity in limbo. But it also deals with some of these other people. Who are some of the other people that you might expect to find in limbo? Well, all the people that have never heard about Christianity. Who would that be? Well, all the people that are outside of Europe, all through the rest of the world, that the missionaries have not gotten to yet. They haven't heard about. How could they be converted to Christianity if they haven't heard about it? They cannot be held responsible. We can't really let them into heaven, but we cannot necessarily condemn them to eternal hell as well. That also includes all the people that were born. You know who else would be in limbo? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Moses, and everybody that you mentioned in the Old Testament. They have not heard of the Roman Catholic Church. The way Dante feels about it, the way he writes about it, he's going to feel very strongly. They cannot go into paradise. They cannot go into heaven. They'll have to be in limbo. I should have looked this up. I do not know whether we have the word limbo. Is there anybody here that didn't know what limbo meant? Was it derived from Dante, or did Dante have that word already to indicate these people that are living in this strange first circle of hell? Let's take a little more look at that. The first circle is resided by these virtuous non-Christians, non-baptized people. They live in a castle with 7 gates, which symbolize the 7 virtues. Dante sees many prominent people from classical antiquity, like Homer, Socrates, Aristotle. All of these people are in limbo. They never had the opportunity. According to Dante, they never had the opportunity to be in paradise. Here's another one. This one's not quite finished. Limbo was on the order, was the outer boundary of hell, just across the river. Unlike the rest of hell, which is deafening with screams and moans and crying, limbo is a quiet except for the sound of. Well, I didn't know what the sound was, and I couldn't find the rest of this slide anywhere. So I looked around and found a very interesting statement about that sound. The sounds of limbo and other circles, unlike the rest of hell, which is deafening with screams, moans, and crying, limbo is quite quiet except for the sound of sighing. Well, you can well imagine that people like Socrates and Plato and Abraham and Isaac were saying, what is this all about? And sighing, what is this? I could not help to wonder, what did God think about this idea of limbo? When I came across this idea, the rest of hell's deafening with screams, moans, and crying, it reminded me of something that was brought to me by Dottie Schultz. Anybody here know who Dottie Schultz was? Our chaplain at the manor, and she came across an interesting article that about things that appear in church bulletins sometimes can be rather humorous, because people are not paying that close attention to what they put in the bulletin. And this one bulletin had on the back page the schedule for the coming Sunday. The sermon on Sunday will be, do you know what hell is? And it was followed by the announcement, come early and listen to our choir rehearse. I guess that appeared. But anyway, it was kind of, and as a matter of fact, in Dante's writings, he does mention the fact that when they were in limbo, they were struck by the fact that it was quiet comparing to all the moans and the crying and the screams and everything else that they heard in the rest of hell. Here are some of the unbaptized people. The second circle is a little bit different. In the second circle, I've got to watch my time. The second circle, Dante and his companion Virgil find people who were overcome by lust. They are punished by being blown violently back and forth by strong winds, preventing them to find peace or rest. One picture of that. Oh, here's a little bit more about that. All right, this also involves the sins of self-indulgence, sins of passion. I got this one picture of them being blown around in that first circle. It's kind of interesting that this first circle involves lust. And what is done is, well, here's a little bit of what I found about the second circle. This particular thing here, talking about Minos, is typical sort of thing that Dante does that we're not always familiar with, and makes use of literature that we're not familiar with, like Greek literature and Greek Greek mythology. But Dante does ask Virgil, are there any others that would be in this area, like those that commit adultery? And this is about this Minos. Dante informed Virgil that people from history and mythology that did commit adultery were Cleopatra, Tristan, Helen of Troy, and others that were adulterous during their lifetime. I had to look in it. Here's Cleopatra and Antony. How do we know they were adulterous? Well, what does it say about Antony and Cleopatra? He had 2 children with Cleopatra before that was over. Tristan and Iseult. This story, as I understand it, is an English story. It's a story that has a Welsh background. And this Tristan is sent by the king to fetch his wife, Iseult. That's the king's wife. But in getting to bring that wife to the palace, they fall in love. This was an adulterous affair. A very famous one is Paris is told that he may have the most beautiful woman in the world, and he goes down to Sparta and he picks out Helen, and he convinces Helen to come with him to Troy, and they live in adultery. And Lancelot and Quinevere, same sort of situation. Quinevere is the wife of Arthur. Potiphar's wife doesn't make it to this level. She didn't get there. Well, if we take a look at the story, we don't find any evidence that Potiphar's wife actually did commit adultery. She managed to get the robe of Joseph, but there was no adultery committed. And yet we have that picture of Potiphar's wife in hell. Well, where is she in hell? Well, that's what we're going to try to find out. Let's look at the third circle. The third circle, Dante and Virgil find souls of gluttons who were overlooked by a worm monster called Cerberus. Again, that's Greek mythology. Sinners in this hell are punished by being forced to lie in a vile slush that is produced by a never-ending icy rain. Not a pleasant eternity. Here is a picture of the third circle. Here's another picture of a glutton. There's another. None of these are very pleasant pictures. I don't think they show the rain quite as much as we might like. There's another one. These are, again, of the third circle. What about the fourth circle? In the fourth circle, Dante and Virgil see the souls of people who are punished for greed. They are divided into 2 groups, those who hoard possessions and those who lavishly spend it, jousting. One of the things that's interesting about Dante's writings that I didn't really have the time to get that far into is that he will often associate the sin that they may have committed, the mortal sin that they may have committed, is reflected in how they have to spend eternity. And that shows up very nicely when we take a look at the people that are in hell because of greed. What these people are doing are pushing up bags of money and the things that they've hoarded up a hill. And the bags keep falling back, and they have to keep pushing them. And they don't even know what's at the top of the hill. And that's the way they're going to spend eternity. That would be a very unpleasant sort of eternity. But it's kind of interesting how Dante, or I should say how, what's his name, Doré was able to portray this. Here is another one that deals with greed. This is somebody worshiping whom? Worshiping Mammon. This is Mammon. See what Mammon's holding in his hand? A bag of money. And who was Mammon? Whoops. Mammon is a demon according to Christian theology and embodies one of the cardinal sins, greed. In fact, this demon's monstrous greed is so powerful that innocent men can be traced and sucked into it and corrupted so that they too focus their attention on building up worldly treasure instead of virtues that could carry with them into the kingdom of heaven. Greed is a rather sorrowful situation. The fifth circle is where wrathful and the sullen are punished for their sins. They're transported by a boat. Dante and Virgil see that the wrathful fighting with each other on the surface of the river Styx. Remember the boat, the picture we had of the boat going across the Styx? Those were the people that were fighting with each other in the Styx. The sullen are gurgling beneath the surface of the water. I like this next picture. Here are the angry. Well, let me ask this question. You know people that are mad about something all the time. They're angry. They cannot be happy unless they're mad. You know people that separate them so much from the world they don't even realize what's going on. They're sullen. They say it doesn't make any difference, can't do anything about it anyway. Kind of interesting that Dante puts these in the fifth circle, puts them at a lower level than lust and in greed and in gluttony. But this attitude that they have is also indicative of the fact that they are committing a mortal sin. Here's that picture that I did show you before. These are the people that he's talking about, that when they were crossing the river Styx, these people were fighting with each other on the surface. Beneath the surface were the sullen. When reaching the sixth circle of hell, Dante sees heretics who are condemned to eternity in flaming tombs. Who are the heretics? Well, as best I can figure out what he means by that, these are the people that have had the chance to what? To listen to what the gospel has to say, but decided no, they didn't need it. They did not need it. And what's going to happen to them? The sixth circle of hell wander around among fiery tombs, the heretics. Virgil describes the particular heresy of one of the groups, the Epicureans, who pursued pleasure in life because they believed that the soul died with the body. That was I think everybody here knows what the Epicureans were. What was their motto? Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. They would be in this circle. Here, I think I have a couple of pictures of the flaming tombs. Boy, that's sensitive. There we can just see the opening of the tomb. There's the tomb. This is a curious one. These are the heretics also. There's the ones that are involved in hypocrisy. They will say one thing but believe another thing. They will say that they are Christians but they really don't believe. They are buried, how? Upside down. And the only thing that Dante was able to see when he was with Virgil are those upside down creatures. The other thing that happens is that very often these people that are heretics get themselves involved with the trees and actually do become a part of the trees. You'll notice that this man's arms are now limbs of the tree. Actually, this same sort of picture shows up with another group of people that are so tangled up with the forest that you can't separate them from the forest. But I found this both in the sixth circle and there. Now, I'm going to go back here and say something about these circles that we've had up to this point. Limbo, lust, gluttony, greed, wrath, and heresy are all rather personal. They deal with the individual and how the individual is going to react to certain situations, whether he's going to be overcome by lust, or he's going to be greed, or he's going to be a glutton, or here. It's you as an individual. You notice something else. Other people are not involved in this. When we get to the next circles, it starts to get a bit more interesting. The seventh circle is divided into 3 rings. The next 3 circles involve interactions of the sinner with other people and the effect that the sin has on other people. Let's read this. The seventh circle of hell is divided into 3 rings. The outer ring houses murderers and others who are violent to other people and property. Here Dante sees Alexander the Great. Some people don't think he belonged there, apparently. And here are some of the other people that are regarded as what? Warriors that had killed a lot of people. Let's see. The middle ring sees the suicides who have been turned into trees and bushes which are fed by harpies. And he sees, I don't have a picture of them being torn by the... This is a very interesting circle to go through, because we ourselves have already done the sort of thing that Dante does in all of these circles, and that is that there are 9 circles of the major sins, but within each circle there are some divisions. Some sins are different from other sins. And I think a good case in point is the case of murder. We do this in our own society. Any of you that have watched any of the reruns of Law and Order in the last few weeks know full well that when it comes to murder, what are you going to find out? We have circles. What? First degree, second degree, first degree manslaughter, and second degree manslaughter. Same sort of thing. Dante does this sort of thing through these circles that we find in hell. Here are the 7 circles. Now, this doesn't show it too well. These people that are in this 7th circle are being rained down by fire. You see the fire coming down upon them. Here are the suicides. It's a different picture of the suicides being a part of the trees. Like I said, it showed up in 2 places. I never was able to interpret what that would actually meant. But now we get to the 8th circle. Have you noticed something kind of interesting? We haven't seen Potiphar's wife yet. We're all the way down to the next to the last circle in hell, and Potiphar's wife doesn't show up until we get to this last circle. The 8th circle entitled fraud. This was probably about as interesting as any to look at as to what you might consider to be fraud. Let's just take the thing that we are looking at in terms of the story of Potiphar's wife. Did Potiphar's wife commit fraud? Yes, she told a lie. She was a false witness. There's Potiphar's wife. She's accusing Joseph by lying. Thou shalt not bear false witness. The commandment is very straight about this. Why? Because in committing your sin, you are hurting somebody else. And it's kind of interesting that Dante puts these 3 levels of hell lower than those first 6, in that these are cases where the mortal sin involves the person not only committing the mortal sin, but hurting somebody else. Was Joseph hurt by the fact that Potiphar's wife had accused him of something he hadn't done? Yes, he was very definitely hurt. There's no question about it. But you can go through this whole thing and you find there's a lot of interesting things to think about. That's why we find that Potiphar's wife ended up in this 8th circle in Doré's paintings. Another example of this is just one of about, I think there are about 5 or 6 or 7 or others. Simony. Let's look at that. Simony is the buying or selling of something spiritual or closely connected with the spiritual. The name is taken from Simon Magus, which we read about in Acts, who endeavored to buy from the apostles the power of conferring the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Let's take a look at that passage. Whoops. Here's Simon Magus. These are Paul And I think then Simon saw that the Spirit was given through the laying of the apostles' hands, and he offered them money, saying, "Give me also this power, that anyone of whom I lay my hands may receive the Holy Spirit." And Peter said to him, "Your silver perish with you, because you thought you could obtain the gift of God with money." One of the things that I think was prevalent at that time, and that is that it was very possible to find yourself in a rather responsible position within the church. And you could get there by doing what? Buying it. You could buy your way into the church. And you could dispense of the things that the church, you could dispense on the forgiveness of sins. You could just also say you could condemn somebody to eternal hell. By somebody who had bought that right. What does Dante say? That is a sin, that's a mortal sin to behave that way. People who purchase the power to act as clergy in order to have what they call special powers of the clergy, and then exercise that special power, are doing what? They're falsifying. They're doing things that are not true. They're lying. I had to include this one. Alchemy was also included. Alchemy was something that preceded chemistry. Modern chemistry, the part that I'm a part of, really did not get started until about the time of the American Revolution, about 1800, that John Dalton and people started talking about atoms and looking at things rather carefully. Prior to that time, way back into antiquity, there were people that had noticed something rather interesting about nature. Let me give you an example of an experiment that sometimes you can see performed in freshman laboratories. Mercuric oxide is a red powder. It's a red powder. Mercuric oxide can be put into a test tube and then heated. And when it's heated up, oxygen is evolved from mercuric oxide. And guess what is left? Liquid mercury. Now this is a rather remarkable transformation. And if you don't know something about chemistry, it looks like, oh my goodness, how were you able to take a red powder and make it into a liquid metal like mercury? If you can do that with one thing, the alchemist said, maybe we can do it with something else. And one of the things that the alchemists were, you might say, prone to do is to convince people to support them in trying to find a way of changing base materials, like lead, for example, and change lead into gold. Give me some money and I'll show you how this is done. And they work on it, and it doesn't necessarily. The other thing that the alchemists do is they kept promising people something that was rather significant called the fountain of youth. Remember Ponce de Leon looking for the fountain? He gets that expression, we get that expression from the alchemists. They promised the fountain of youth. We'll find the fountain of youth if you give us the money. Did they ever find it? Did they ever really expect to find it? I don't know if they ever really expected to find it or not. Like I say, there are many other examples of this that we find in that circle. What about the ninth circle? Is there something that's worse than what we find in that eighth circle? Yes, there's one thing that is worse. And that is, there is the same thing where some pain is inflicted on somebody. Some pain is inflicted on somebody, and the somebody that it's inflicted on had trust in the sinner giving the pain. In other words, it is a word that we call betrayal. The prime example of betrayal is what? Cain murdering his brother Abel. What should Abel have expected from his older brother Cain? To be protected by Cain, and to trust the fact that Cain was his older brother and would be for him. But what did Cain do? Cain murdered Abel. There are other examples. One very interesting example comes from literature and also from history. When Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March, he was assassinated by these senators. What we find here is that Caesar is saying something, to this man. Does anybody know, can anybody quote what he said?
Et tu,
Et
Brutus.
tu, Brute. And you, Brutus. Brutus was one of Julius Caesar's closest friends. And Brutus was about to do what? Put a sword into Caesar. Actually, Brutus is also regarded as an example of betrayal. But what is the prime example of betrayal? Judas. What was Judas's position? Jesus had many disciples, but he had a chosen few. And Judas was among those chosen few. He's among those 12. There is one passage in, I don't remember which gospel it is, but Jesus turns to Judas and says to Judas, go do your thing, indicating that there might have been a special relationship between Judas and Jesus, and that he was a very good friend of Judas. And yet, who was it that betrayed Jesus? It was Judas. The word betrayal and Judas are almost synonymous. As a matter of fact, we use the word Judas to portray betrayal. What we find then from the story that we have in Genesis of Potiphar's wife, she does not end up giving the most heinous of sin, participating in the most heinous of sins, but very near it, and hurting somebody else. They are on circle 9, and there are 10 circles. What is in the 10th circle? Here is the 10th circle. Satan himself. Now, I won't say too much more about it other than what Dante writes about is that we do find Satan sitting in a block of ice in the 10th circle, devouring anything that comes in his stead. I won't say anything more about it than that. That is it. Now, what I found interesting is that how Dante could look at this whole situation of Potiphar's wife and look at the whole situation of sin and sort of tip it over topsy from the way an awful lot of people were to set these things up. If you were to think of a lot of people that were involved in sin, you would probably think of something very much akin to what we see in circle 2, in circle lust. And where does he put that circle? Way near the top. He doesn't find that people involved in carnal problems are as evil as those involved in even greed or even gluttony. On the other hand, is it very possible that we can see many people and look at them day by day and say they are fine people, but secretly they have done something or said something that what may hurt something but hurt somebody else. And where does Dante put them? Very near the depth of the sins that man could commit. He looks at things that quite differently. A question one might ask is this sort of idea going to last? Well, this was written around 700 years ago. And you want to go to the internet and find out how many references there are to Dante's Inferno, that people to this day are still studying the things that they find in the Inferno rather carefully. This is one of the reasons I found this kind of interesting to go back at. The things that I have on these slides right now are sort of updated from the thing that Carl may have sent you, which was going to be the PowerPoint for this presentation. I've updated it a little bit. If you'd like to get a hold of that, let Carl know. But all I can say is that the little bit that I've said about Dante's Inferno here is nothing more than what? A thumbnail sketch of everything that is there. Now, as I indicated earlier, I'm not going to go into what follows. As you saw from the reading of the chapter 39, Joseph is in prison. And what is happening in prison? He's becoming helpful to the seer in prison. From that point on, things move rather quickly in a very interesting fashion. Very quickly, let me tell you what happens and why we want to look at this rather carefully and not in a hurried manner. One of the things that happens very quickly is that what we find is that Joseph is able to interpret dreams of the baker and the butler. And because he was able to interpret those dreams properly, he managed to get released from prison because Pharaoh is having dreams. And Joseph is able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. And Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dreams to such an extent that Pharaoh realizes something should be done about an oncoming famine. And the way Joseph has spoken, he says, "You are the man to do it." And all of a sudden we find this Egyptian king appointing this man who was just in prison as the prime minister of Egypt. That is astonishing in itself. Then we find out that Joseph is quite successful in getting things so that a famine that does follow 7 years later prompts his family back in Canaan to come to Egypt. And Joseph's brothers are going to be sent to Egypt. They do not know if Joseph is dead or alive. They certainly do not know whether Joseph is the prime minister. So they have this meeting of Joseph and his brothers. And the way this is handled in the book of Genesis is fantastic. Does Joseph reveal himself immediately? No. He plays with them. He plays with them through 2 or 3 chapters. Rather intriguing writing, to say the very least, before he finally reveals to them that I am Joseph, the brother that you kidnapped. That prompts Joseph to urge Jacob and the whole family to move down to Egypt. They move down to Egypt because, after all, Joseph is a prime minister of that area where they're going to live. They are going to live very well, and they do, and they prosper living in Egypt. And one of the first verses that we have in the book of Exodus says what? And there came a Pharaoh that did not know Joseph. And all of a sudden we find out that the people that were in Egypt for all that time were suddenly under a different Pharaoh. Now, what had happened is kind of interesting in a number of ways, because there are questions that need to be answered that we can answer from history. One of these questions is this: how did Mesopotamians, such as Abraham and his family, who came from Mesopotamia way back far in the east, hundreds of miles from Egypt, how did they end up in Egypt? Why do we find them in Egypt? What had transpired that brought them all the way to Egypt? How is it that an Egyptian pharaoh will suddenly take a man who was just a prisoner and suddenly make him what? Make him the prime minister. Up until 1800 or so, you would read these stories that we find in the book of Exodus and in Numbers and say, well, that's what it says in the Bible. But with the advent of modern archaeology, guess what? We find evidences of the history of that period, both in terms of Egyptian history and Mesopotamian history, that help to explain why it is that the Semitic people that were living in Mesopotamia ended up way there in Egypt. Why it was that a pharaoh, a king of Egypt, would appoint another Semitic to become the prime minister. And it all falls in very nicely once we understand about what was going on in the world at that time. With the advent of the discovery of the ability to read Egyptian literature, we get Egyptian history. And once we know something about Egyptian history, hey, that makes perfectly good sense that that could have happened. A little more difficult to figure out how did these people leave Mesopotamia and come all the way to the west, all the way to Canaan. Again, it becomes rather apparent when you take a look at the history of the things that happened in Mesopotamia. In the next few months, I'm going to be going over both what we have in Egyptian history and Mesopotamian history to show how these things influence what we read about in this book of Genesis and Exodus. Next week is going to be something very, very different. And I'll tell you right now what it is. It's all about Israel's maritime efforts and all the ships and the boats that the Egyptian, never mind, next week.